It was a bright afternoon in the heart of the city. The streets were bustling with people walking to their destinations, cars honking occasionally as they navigated the busy roads, and the distant hum of everyday city life filled the air. Among the crowd, one man moved calmly, almost blending into the everyday chaos around him. He was dressed in plain clothes, nothing flashy, carrying only a small bag slung over his shoulder. His steps were steady, confident, and unhurried, yet there was something in the way he moved that made him stand out, though no one around him noticed it at first. Meanwhile, not far from him, a police officer sat in his patrol car, parked at the corner of the street. This officer had a reputation in the precinct: strict, no-nonsense, and quick to assume the worst in situations that seemed suspicious to him. Over the years, his colleagues had learned to steer clear of his sharp temper, and he had earned a reputation for being aggressive, especially when it came to handling civilians he considered different or out of place. Today, his eyes scanned the street carefully, looking for anything or anyone that might need his attention. The man walking down the street had no idea that he was about to attract the officer's attention. He was simply going about his day, maybe running errands, maybe heading somewhere important. No one could tell. But the officer, noticing the man's presence, immediately let his instincts take over. His gaze lingered on the man, and a quiet tension began to build in the scene. The officer's mind started forming assumptions almost instantly. To him, this man looked suspicious. His manner of walking, his calm demeanor, even his appearance, everything seemed to set off warning bells in the officer's mind. As the man continued walking, the officer stepped out of his car, moving with a sense of authority and purpose. He positioned himself in a way that blocked part of the sidewalk, making it clear that he intended to stop the man. From a distance, the man might have seemed ordinary, but to the officer, he now represented uncertainty, a situation that needed to be controlled immediately. The city, alive and unaware, continued its usual rhythm, but a quiet tension hovered around this small encounter that was about to unfold. The man noticed the officer approaching but remained calm. He didn't raise his voice or show any signs of fear, though inside, he was aware that something unusual was happening. The officer, on the other hand, walked toward him with a mixture of suspicion and authority. Every step the officer took seemed to amplify the intensity of the moment, even though, to an outside observer, it might have looked like nothing more than a routine interaction. There were people around, some walking past without paying attention, others glancing curiously at the unfolding scene. Smartphones were being subtly raised, capturing moments of the day that might later be shared online, but at that moment, no one knew the significance of what they were witnessing. The man's calm and composed presence contrasted sharply with the officer's rigid posture and sharp expression. It was clear that both individuals were from very different worlds, each carrying a sense of authority in their own way, one official, the other quiet but confident. The officer's mind raced with questions he hadn't even asked aloud yet. Why is he walking this way? Why does he look so composed when most people would be nervous around law enforcement? The answers didn't matter yet. What mattered was the officer's perception, and in his eyes, this man was a potential problem that needed to be addressed immediately. Meanwhile, the man, sensing the officer's attention, slowed his pace slightly but did not change direction or show any sign of nervousness. He knew he had done nothing wrong and had no reason to fear an encounter that, from his perspective, should be routine. And so, the stage was set. The ordinary city street, with its usual noise and motion, became the backdrop for an extraordinary moment that was about to unfold. Two people, one calm, one suspicious, were moving toward an inevitable confrontation, each guided by their own sense of reality. The man's confidence and composure would soon collide with the officer's assumptions and biases, creating a scene that would leave an impression on everyone who witnessed it. What seemed like an ordinary afternoon was quietly transforming into something intense, gripping, and unforgettable. Even before a single word was exchanged, the tension was palpable. Passers-by might have felt a subtle shift in the air, a quiet alert that something unusual was happening. The officer, fully focused, prepared to assert control, while the man, unaware of how deeply this encounter would affect both of their lives, continued his steady walk. Little did anyone know, the next few minutes would turn what looked like a routine police stop into a story that nobody would forget anytime soon. The man continued walking down the bustling city street, unaware that the officer had now fully focused on him. The sun reflected off the pavement, and the air carried the usual mix of car fumes, chatter, and distant music from a nearby cafe. People passed by, some absorbed in their own worlds, others glancing briefly at the man and the officer. But in that fleeting glance, no one could have predicted the tension that was quietly building. The officer, now standing in the middle of the sidewalk, squared his shoulders and approached with deliberate authority. Each step seemed measured, almost theatrical, as if he was signaling that no one could ignore him. He raised his hand, signaling for the man to stop. The man, slightly startled but calm, slowed down and came to a halt. He raised his hand slightly in a non-threatening manner and looked at the officer, his expression polite and questioning. "Good afternoon, officer," he said. "Is there a problem?" The officer studied him carefully, taking in his posture, his calm voice, and the way he carried himself. Every detail seemed to challenge the officer's expectations, yet the suspicion in his mind only grew. "I need to ask you a few questions," the officer said, his tone sharp but official. "Why are you walking around here? What's in the bag?" The man tilted his head slightly, a hint of amusement flashing across his face. "I'm just heading to an appointment," he replied. "And it's just personal items, nothing suspicious." His voice was steady, and he maintained eye contact, showing no sign of fear or anxiety. To an ordinary observer, it might have seemed like a routine interaction, yet the officer's mind was already clouded with assumptions. The officer's gaze hardened. "I need to see some ID," he said. His words carried the weight of authority, but underneath, there was a subtle tension, a mixture of suspicion, bias, and the need to assert control. The man reached slowly into his pocket, remaining calm and composed, producing a standard ID card. The officer took it, inspecting it with a critical eye. But nothing in the card immediately satisfied him. It was as if the officer's perception had already created a story in his mind, and he was determined to confirm it. Around them, the street carried on as usual, but the air felt heavier. Pedestrians began to glance at the unfolding scene, some raising phones to capture the encounter, others stopping momentarily to see if it would escalate. The man noticed the glances but remained composed, understanding that reacting aggressively could make the situation worse. Meanwhile, the officer's impatience grew. Every second that passed without the man showing signs of nervousness or guilt seemed to fuel the officer's frustration. "Where are you coming from? Where are you going?" the officer asked, his tone now bordering on accusatory. The man replied calmly, giving straightforward answers without hesitation. His composure contrasted sharply with the officer's tense demeanor, and the difference in their behavior only heightened the officer's suspicion. He expected fear, hesitation, or nervousness, but there was none. Instead, the man's confidence seemed to silently challenge the officer, a subtle reminder that appearances could be deceiving. The encounter had begun to attract more attention. A few bystanders slowed their pace, whispering to each other, and some began recording with their phones. Social media feeds were unknowingly about to be filled with a clip of this moment. The man's calmness in the face of escalating tension began to impress those watching, while the officer's rigid posture and narrow assumptions began to draw criticism from onlookers, though no one spoke up yet. Suddenly, the officer leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice in a controlled but menacing manner. "Look, I know something's not right here. Don't try to lie to me. I can tell when people aren't honest." His words, intended to intimidate, only highlighted the officer's reliance on bias rather than facts. The man, however, didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled faintly, almost knowingly, and said, "Officer, I'm not lying. You're assuming things because of how I look. I understand why you might feel that way, but I assure you, there's nothing wrong here." The officer's eyes narrowed, a mix of disbelief and frustration crossing his features. He had expected compliance, fear, or at least hesitation. Instead, the man was speaking with confidence, almost as if he were aware of a truth that the officer could not yet see. The dynamic shifted subtly, the calmness of one man against the rigid suspicion of the other, a silent battle of perception and authority. At that moment, a small group of people had stopped across the street, curious but cautious. The tension was palpable. Even the ambient sounds of the city seemed to fade, replaced by an invisible spotlight on the two men. The officer, feeling his authority subtly challenged, straightened and demanded, "Step aside. I need to verify everything now." The man nodded slowly, following the officer's instructions, but with an air of quiet dignity. He wasn't resisting, yet he wasn't intimidated either. It was clear that this encounter was no longer just about a routine ID check or casual suspicion. It had evolved into a clash between assumptions and reality, between prejudice and composure. The officer had already constructed a narrative in his mind, but the man's calm, measured behavior refused to fit into it. Every word, every gesture, every step of the man subtly challenged the officer's bias, creating an undercurrent of tension that no one present could ignore. And so, the encounter continued, a delicate dance of authority and composure, suspicion and truth. Each moment built upon the last, leading inevitably toward a revelation that would completely upend the officer's assumptions and leave everyone watching stunned. The ordinary city street, full of life and motion, had become the stage for an extraordinary moment, one that would challenge perceptions, provoke reflection, and set the stage for a twist nobody would see coming. The air between the officer and the man had grown taut, almost like a stretched rope ready to snap. Passers-by, once casually walking by, now slowed their pace, sensing the tension. Phones were subtly raised, capturing every movement, every gesture. The city street, usually alive with ordinary chatter, felt suspended in a bubble of anticipation. It wasn't just an encounter anymore, it had become a confrontation, though no violence had occurred yet. The officer's eyes narrowed as he scrutinized the man again. Every small detail, the tilt of his head, the calmness in his expression, even the way he adjusted his bag strap, seemed to fuel suspicion rather than allay it. "Tell me again where you're going and why," the officer demanded, his tone sharper now, carrying a weight that suggested consequences were imminent. There was an edge in his voice, the kind that comes from someone who believes he has the power to control the narrative. The man met the officer's gaze without flinching. "I told you, I'm heading to an appointment," he said calmly. "There's nothing unusual about me, and I haven't done anything wrong." His voice remained measured, almost serene, yet underneath, a keen awareness of the officer's suspicion kept him alert. He knew that escalating the situation would only make matters worse, so he chose composure over confrontation. But the officer wasn't satisfied. Suspicion had turned into accusation in his mind. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice into a tone meant to intimidate. "I know you're hiding something," he said. "People like you don't just walk around like nothing's wrong. I've seen it all before." Every word dripped with prejudice, assumptions fueled by years of implicit bias. The man's calm demeanor only seemed to irritate the officer further, it was as if the officer needed visible fear to justify his suspicion. Around them, a few bystanders had stopped completely. Some whispered to one another, sharing glances that carried silent questions. Why is this officer so aggressive? Why does the man remain so calm? A subtle tension rippled through the small crowd, a mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and fascination. Social media feeds were silently waiting to be updated. This was the kind of real-life drama that always sparked viral discussions. The officer gestured sharply, indicating that the man should step aside to the curb. "Step over there, now. And don't make any sudden moves." His words were a mixture of command and warning, but the man moved with deliberate calm, understanding the need to comply without seeming submissive. He stepped to the side, maintaining a posture that was polite yet confident. It was a delicate balance, any sign of agitation could escalate the situation further, but too much compliance might be interpreted as guilt. The officer continued his questioning, his eyes scanning the man's belongings and the way he shifted his weight. "What's in the bag?" What are you doing in this neighborhood? His voice grew louder, though he tried to maintain the facade of control. Each question, meant to provoke a reaction, instead highlighted the man's patience and composure. To anyone watching, the scene began to resemble a test of wills, one person fueled by suspicion, the other by quiet confidence. The man finally spoke again, his voice steady but firm. Everything I have is personal, officer. I'm not hiding anything, and I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm sure you can verify that if needed. His words were simple, yet they carried a subtle challenge. Calmness in the face of confrontation can be more powerful than aggression. The officer's frustration visibly grew, his assumptions clashed with the reality he was witnessing, and he struggled to maintain authority. As the tension grew, the officer's body language became more rigid. He clenched his jaw, his hands moved slightly as if ready to act, and his tone hardened. I've been doing this job for years, he said, almost defensively. I can tell when someone's lying. And right now, you're lying to me. His voice carried not just accusation, but certainty, a certainty born from bias, not fact. The man, however, showed no sign of faltering. His calm, unshaken demeanor became the silent center of the unfolding storm. The small crowd around them reacted subtly. Some murmured, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others continued recording, sensing that this moment was becoming more than just a routine police stop. The atmosphere felt heavy, charged with anticipation. Even the background noises of the city, the cars, the conversations, the distant music, seemed to fade in comparison to the tension building between the two men. The officer, unable to reconcile the man's calmness with his own assumptions, took a step closer. Listen, I don't have time for games. I need the truth, and I need it now. His insistence was almost desperate, a mix of authority and frustration. The man's response was quiet but pointed. I've already told you the truth. You're assuming things about me that aren't real. Maybe it's time to reconsider those assumptions before this goes further. The words hung in the air, like a quiet challenge. For a moment, the officer paused, caught off guard by the clarity and confidence in the man's voice. But even as he processed it, his suspicion remained. In his mind, he had constructed a narrative, and now that narrative was being questioned, subtly, without violence or disrespect. It was a battle of perception, one that drew the attention of everyone on the street. The encounter had escalated far beyond what either the officer or the man might have anticipated. What had started as a simple stop had transformed into a tense, almost cinematic confrontation. Both men represented authority in their own ways, one official, the other composed and self-assured. And yet, the officer's rigid assumptions and the man's calm defiance created a friction that seemed impossible to resolve without revelation. Unbeknownst to the officer, the next few moments would completely upend his assumptions. The man's identity, hidden until now, held the power to transform the confrontation into something unforgettable. The crowd, the phones, the tense standoff, all were quietly building toward a twist that nobody on the street could have predicted. The ordinary city street had become the stage for an extraordinary escalation, a moment where bias met truth, and where patience met suspicion. And so, the scene remained charged, every second stretching longer than the last. The officer's frustration was palpable, the man's calmness unshakable. Everyone watching could feel the tension, wondering what would happen next. Neither man moved toward violence, yet the energy between them was almost electric. This was not just a confrontation, it was a revelation waiting to happen, a story about perception, prejudice, and the quiet power of composure. The tension on the street had reached a boiling point, though outwardly nothing violent had happened. The officer stood rigid, his hands hovering near his belt, eyes sharp and calculating. He had been trained to notice the smallest details, to read people like open books, but in this case, everything he thought he knew seemed to be slipping away. The man in front of him remained calm, composed, almost unnervingly so, as if he knew the officer's mind better than the officer knew himself. The officer took a deep breath, trying to regain control. He squinted, scrutinizing the man as though staring harder would reveal some hidden clue. Every small gesture, the way the man shifted his weight, the slight adjustment of his jacket, the steady gaze, was catalogued in the officer's mind. Yet, each observation only deepened his suspicion. Why doesn't he look nervous? Why isn't he scared? He muttered under his breath. He had expected fear, hesitation, maybe even fidgeting. Instead, he saw confidence, almost arrogance, and it threw him off balance. The man, aware of the scrutiny, did not flinch. He kept his posture straight, his eyes calm but attentive. Inside, he was calculating too, assessing the officer's mood, predicting his next move. But outwardly, he exuded nothing but serenity. This calmness, ironically, only seemed to escalate the officer's bias. The officer's mind was now spinning narratives. Maybe he was lying, maybe he had something to hide, maybe he was dangerous. Assumptions replaced facts, and each one felt more convincing to the officer than the last. Around them, the street had quieted slightly, though cars still passed and a few pedestrians lingered at a safe distance. Some whispered to each other, "Why is the officer acting like this? He hasn't done anything yet. Look at how calm he is, doesn't he even care?" Phones were recording every moment. The man's composure was becoming a spectacle, while the officer's increasingly rigid demeanor drew attention and quiet criticism. Every passerby seemed to sense that the officer was letting assumptions drive his actions rather than reality. The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice into a tone meant to intimidate. "Listen," he said, "I've been doing this job a long time. I can tell when someone's hiding something. Right now, I know you're not telling me the whole truth." His words were sharp, deliberate, meant to provoke a reaction, but the man didn't respond with fear or anger. Instead, he offered the same calm demeanor. "Officer, I understand why you might feel suspicious. But assumptions are dangerous. You're assuming things about me because of how I look, how I move, how I carry myself. That doesn't make me guilty of anything." The officer's jaw tightened. "I don't assume, I know. I can tell. People like you don't just walk around like this without something hidden." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unfair. The man's calm gaze did not waver, but his internal mind raced. He had seen this before, people who judged too quickly, people who equated appearance with intent. He understood that no argument would change the officer's mind immediately, only a revelation would. As the verbal standoff continued, subtle cues from the crowd added another layer to the tension. One person muttered under their breath, "Why is he acting like that?" Another whispered, "He hasn't done anything wrong." The officer didn't notice, he was too caught up in his own narrative. To him, every murmured comment, every glance from the bystanders, only confirmed that the man was aware of the attention he was drawing, and maybe enjoying it. That thought only strengthened the officer's belief that the man was hiding something, even though nothing in reality supported that conclusion. The man spoke again, calmly but firmly. "Officer, if your goal is safety, questioning me is fine. But judging me before knowing the facts only creates danger where none exists. My presence here is harmless. I have nothing to hide, and I am cooperating fully." His words were carefully measured, designed to diffuse tension without conceding authority. He understood the delicate balance: push too hard, and the officer could escalate; push too little, and the assumptions would dominate the situation. The officer's frustration now became visible. His hands clenched slightly at his sides, his posture rigid. He couldn't reconcile the calmness in front of him with the stories his mind had already written. Every small movement the man made, from adjusting his sleeve to the way he maintained eye contact, felt calculated in the officer's mind. The officer's bias had completely overtaken reason. He believed that composure was a sign of deception, that calmness must mean guilt. Meanwhile, the man's true composure came from discipline, awareness, and confidence in his own identity, a fact invisible to the officer. The street seemed to shrink around them. Noise faded, the focus of everyone nearby was on this escalating encounter. The officer began to interrogate further, asking for more details about the man's purpose in the neighborhood, the contents of his bag, even the route he had taken to arrive there. Every question was loaded with suspicion, yet every answer the man gave was truthful and calm. The contrast only intensified the officer's frustration, because in his mind, truth and calmness could not coexist with what he assumed to be deceit. As tension mounted, the officer's assumptions began to dominate his actions. He stepped closer, positioning himself more aggressively, hoping to assert control over the situation physically if verbal dominance failed. The man remained unmoved, neither stepping back nor reacting with aggression. Each step the officer took, each interrogative tone he used, only heightened the anticipation among onlookers. People whispered, filmed, and watched, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding, though no one yet knew what it would be. The internal battle inside the officer reached a critical point. His mind raced with assumptions, forming stories about the man. Maybe he was a criminal, maybe he was dangerous, maybe he was lying. These narratives were entirely imagined, yet they felt undeniably real to him. Every instinct, every bias, every preconceived notion had become the lens through which he viewed the man. Meanwhile, the man, fully aware of the assumptions, maintained composure, knowing that only time and revelation would shift the balance. And in that suspended moment, it became clear, the encounter had transformed. It was no longer simply a police stop. It was a clash of perception versus reality, assumption versus truth. The officer's suspicions ruled his actions, while the man's quiet confidence commanded the narrative, even without words. The street itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the next moments would determine the outcome of this tense confrontation, moments that would soon reveal a twist nobody could have predicted. The tension on the street had reached its peak. Pedestrians lingered at a safe distance, some frozen in place, others whispering to each other as they held up their phones, capturing the unfolding drama. Even the hum of the city, the distant honking of cars, the faint chatter from cafes, the rhythmic footsteps of hurried commuters, seemed to fade into the background. All attention was drawn to the officer and the man, locked in a silent standoff, their energy crackling like electricity in the air. The officer, frustrated and on edge, leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping into a sharper, almost threatening tone. "Look, I've been doing this job for years," he said, "and I know when someone's hiding something. I can feel it. And right now, you're hiding something from me." His words were heavy with authority, his eyes narrowing, scanning the man from head to toe. Every subtle gesture the man made seemed to the officer like evidence of deceit. The calmness in front of him was unnerving. The man remained unflinching. He had anticipated this moment, and he knew it required patience, not confrontation. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The officer stiffened, instinctively stepping back slightly, suspicion and caution mixing with the faintest hint of curiosity. The man pulled out a wallet-like object, holding it carefully between his hands, as if presenting something sacred. "Officer," the man began, his tone calm but deliberate, "I think it's time you see the truth for yourself." With a smooth motion, he opened the wallet and revealed an official badge. It gleamed in the sunlight, unmistakable in its authenticity. The letters, FBI, were boldly stamped on the metal surface, catching the officer's eyes. For a moment, the street seemed to stop. Pedestrians froze mid-step, phones lowering slowly as they processed what they were seeing. The officer's jaw tightened, and then slackened slightly in disbelief. His mind raced. This wasn't just unexpected, it was impossible, at least in the framework of his assumptions. The calm man he had been scrutinizing, the man he had assumed was suspicious, possibly dangerous, and concealing something, was not only law enforcement, he was federal law enforcement. The FBI agent kept his gaze steady, observing the officer's reaction. He did not speak again immediately, allowing the weight of the revelation to sink in. Around them, whispers erupted. "Wait, is that an FBI badge? No way, he's federal. I can't believe this." The murmurs spread through the small crowd like wildfire, tension giving way to astonishment and incredulity. The officer blinked several times, as if trying to convince himself that what he was seeing was real. "You You're FBI? He stammered, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of surprise. All the assumptions, the rigid narratives he had built in his mind, crumbled instantly. Every detail he had misinterpreted now appeared in a new light, and the reality of his error was undeniable. The man nodded, still calm, still composed. Yes, he said quietly. I'm FBI. I was in the area on official business. There is no reason for any of this to have escalated based on assumptions. His tone was neither angry nor accusatory, it carried authority and a subtle reminder that respect and professionalism are paramount. The officer's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and frustration washing over him. His rigid posture softened slightly, though the tension in his hands and shoulders remained. He had assumed guilt, had relied entirely on prejudice, and now he was confronted with the undeniable truth. His mind, which had been clouded by bias, was now forced to process the reality of his mistake. The street, which had been a stage for suspicion and tension, now became a theater of revelation and self-reflection. Bystanders whispered among themselves, some openly shaking their heads, others chuckling quietly at the absurdity of the situation. A few people raised their phones higher, realizing that the footage they were capturing would go viral. The irony was undeniable. A man had been judged, detained, and scrutinized for appearances, only to reveal an authority far greater than that of the officer who had stopped him. The officer cleared his throat, attempting to regain composure. I didn't know, he admitted, his voice low, almost ashamed. He had been so confident in his assumptions that the truth felt like a punch to the gut. I should have asked first, checked properly. His words faltered, revealing the depth of his realization. The FBI agent nodded again, his calm presence acting as both a reassurance and a silent lesson. Officer, he said, you have a duty to uphold the law and protect civilians, yes. But assumptions and bias can cloud judgment. Today could have gone very differently if I hadn't shown you this. He pocketed the badge slowly, the motion deliberate, controlled, and commanding respect. The officer, still absorbing the revelation, stepped back slightly, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked around at the small crowd, then back at the man, his earlier authority replaced by a mix of humility and astonishment. It was a rare, humbling moment, the realization that prejudice, no matter how subtle, can lead even trained professionals astray. The man took a small step forward, not threatening, but bridging the distance with a calm, steady presence. It's not just about what I do, he said quietly. It's about how we treat people, how quickly we judge. Today is a lesson, not just for you, officer, but for anyone watching, for anyone who assumes based on appearances instead of facts. His words, simple yet profound, seemed to resonate through the street. Pedestrians nodded quietly, some murmuring in agreement. The officer's shoulders relaxed, and he finally exhaled, the tension visibly leaving his body. You're right, he admitted. I judged too quickly. I assumed too much. I'm sorry. The apology, though quiet, carried weight. In that moment, the confrontation had transformed into a rare, reflective exchange, a humanizing experience for both men, and a lesson for all who had been watching. The small crowd began to disperse slowly, the atmosphere shifting from tense anticipation to a mixture of relief and disbelief. Some murmured about what they had just witnessed, others laughed quietly at the irony, while many continued filming, knowing that this was a story that would be shared and talked about for weeks to come. The street, once ordinary and bustling, now carried the memory of an extraordinary moment. A moment where assumptions collided with truth, where bias confronted reality, and where calm composure revealed the unexpected identity of someone who commanded respect. The FBI agent, still composed, walked away with measured steps, leaving the officer to reflect on the encounter, the crowd to ponder what they had witnessed, and the city to resume its rhythm, though now, the story of the day had changed everything for those who had been there. The revelation had settled like a heavy weight over the street, though its impact extended far beyond the immediate moment. The officer stood frozen, blinking rapidly, as if trying to process every detail all at once. The man in front of him, the calm, composed figure who had endured scrutiny, suspicion, and assumptions, was no ordinary civilian. He was FBI, a fact so starkly opposed to the officer's narrative that it threatened to undo the years of confidence and authority the officer had carried with him. For the officer, every muscle tensed in a peculiar combination of embarrassment, disbelief, and self-reflection. His eyes darted briefly toward the small crowd, now buzzing with whispered conversations and excited murmurs. The onlookers had become witnesses to a rare moment, the unraveling of assumptions and the power of truth. Some shook their heads slowly, others exchanged incredulous glances, and a few quietly chuckled at the irony of it all. The officer's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Inside, his mind replayed the events over and over. The man's calm composure, the precise answers, the lack of hesitation, all of it had contradicted what the officer believed he knew about people who seemed suspicious. He had built a narrative in his mind, one shaped not by evidence, but by assumptions, bias, and years of conditioned perception. And now, that narrative lay in ruins. The realization hit hard: he had judged someone based solely on appearances, and the truth had been far from what he expected. The FBI agent, noticing the officer's moment of hesitation, spoke quietly, deliberately. "It's easy to assume. We all do it. But assumptions can lead to mistakes, sometimes dangerous ones. Today could have gone differently if I hadn't revealed who I am." His voice was calm but firm, carrying authority without aggression. The officer's gaze dropped to the ground, his hands unconsciously tightening into fists before relaxing again. The weight of accountability pressed upon him, an invisible reminder that judgment based on bias is a form of failure in his line of work. Around them, the street seemed to hold its collective breath. Pedestrians whispered, recording continued, and the moment became a lesson not just for the officer, but for everyone present. Some murmured about racial profiling and assumptions, while others debated the audacity of the encounter. The man's calm demeanor and professional revelation had shifted the focus from suspicion to reflection. People began questioning their own biases in subtle, introspective ways, wondering how easily they might misjudge someone in a split second. The officer finally spoke, his voice low and measured, though laced with regret. I assumed too much. I let my judgments cloud my actions. I'm sorry." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of acknowledgement. The FBI agent nodded slightly, accepting the apology without fanfare, understanding that confrontation often requires patience before reflection follows. "Acknowledging it is the first step," he said. "Learning from it is the next." Internally, the officer's mind raced. He thought about the countless times he had stopped someone because of assumptions, their appearance, their race, their mannerisms. How many times had he acted on bias rather than facts? How many moments of potential misunderstanding, humiliation, or injustice had he been a part of? Each reflection was painful, yet necessary. The encounter forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth: authority carries responsibility, and assumptions can undermine justice. Meanwhile, the bystanders slowly began to disperse, their whispers lingering in the air. Some commented on the bravery and composure of the man who had revealed his identity. Others spoke about the officer's visible discomfort and the lessons inherent in the situation. Smartphones continued to record, ensuring that the encounter would ripple far beyond this street. The narrative was no longer just about an officer stopping someone, it had transformed into a story about perception, bias, and the unexpected power of calm professionalism. The FBI agent, now stepping back slightly, addressed the remaining crowd. "It's not just about me or the officer," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the murmurs. "It's about understanding that every individual deserves fairness, regardless of assumptions. We all have responsibilities, law enforcement, civilians, and bystanders alike. Today is a reminder to pause before judging, to question biases, and to act with awareness and integrity." His words resonated quietly, leaving a lasting impression on everyone within earshot. The officer nodded slowly, still absorbing the weight of the encounter. He looked down the street, noticing the subtle shifts in people's expressions, curiosity, reflection, even skepticism. For the first time, he truly felt the power of accountability. The realization was humbling: authority is meaningless without fairness, and experience is meaningless without reflection. Every assumption he had made about the man had been proven wrong, and the lesson was unforgettable. The small crowd that remained began to offer subtle gestures of acknowledgement. Some nodded toward the officer, recognizing his willingness to reflect. Others whispered to one another about the importance of challenging assumptions in everyday life. The air, once thick with tension and anticipation, now carried a sense of introspection and calm. It was a rare, almost sacred moment on a city street, an ordinary place transformed into a stage for revelation, growth, and awareness. Inside the officer, a quiet determination began to take shape. He realized that moments like these were opportunities, moments to confront bias, to improve judgment, and to ensure that authority was exercised with fairness. The embarrassment and frustration that had initially consumed him slowly gave way to clarity. Today had been a humbling lesson, one that he would carry forward in every encounter, every decision, and every interaction. The FBI agent, now ready to leave, offered a final, calm nod to the officer. "Remember this," he said softly, "assumptions are easy. Understanding takes effort. Never forget which matters more." With that, he turned and walked away, his steps measured and confident, leaving a trail of reflection behind him. The crowd gradually dispersed, the street returning to its usual rhythm, but the memory of the encounter lingered like a quiet echo, a story that would be shared, discussed, and remembered. For the officer, the reflection continued long after the man had left. Every detail replayed in his mind, the calm composure, the badge, the undeniable truth. He had been challenged, humbled, and reminded that authority is only as valuable as the fairness with which it is applied. And as the city carried on around him, life buzzing with ordinary motion, he silently vowed to carry this lesson forward, to pause before judging, to question assumptions, and to act with awareness, integrity, and respect for every individual he encountered. The street had begun to return to its usual rhythm, though the atmosphere still carried the subtle residue of tension and awe. The once ordinary intersection had transformed into a stage where perceptions collided with reality, assumptions were dismantled, and the power of truth had quietly prevailed. The officer remained standing where the encounter had ended, his posture still rigid but softened, his mind a whirlwind of reflection. Every step, every word, every fleeting expression from the man, the FBI agent, played on a loop in his thoughts. The FBI agent, walking away with measured, confident steps, maintained a calm presence that seemed to ripple through the crowd even after he had departed. He understood the importance of his role, not just in enforcing the law, but in setting an example for the officers, the bystanders, and the broader public who had witnessed the encounter. His actions had been deliberate, a balance of authority, composure, and patience, and he knew that the impact of this moment would extend far beyond the street itself. The officer, meanwhile, had turned inward. He replayed every aspect of the encounter in his mind, the initial stop, the rapid assumptions, the escalating tension, and finally, the revelation of the man's identity. Each memory carried a lesson, each detail a reminder of the fragility of perception when colored by bias. He understood now that authority alone does not guarantee righteousness, judgment guided by prejudice can erode trust, compromise professionalism, and potentially harm those it is meant to protect. A few bystanders lingered, speaking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. Some debated the officer's conduct, while others marveled at the composure of the man who had revealed his FBI credentials. Yet, all recognized a central truth: the encounter had become a lesson in human behavior, perception, and accountability. Phones continued to record, capturing the subtle interactions, the expressions, and the tension, preserving the moment for a wider audience who might learn from it, far beyond the city streets. The officer finally took a deep breath, feeling a sense of responsibility heavier than any he had experienced in years on the force. He knew that moments like this demanded more than internal reflection, they required action. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, could have serious consequences. Today, by chance, the consequences were mitigated. But what about the next encounter? What about those situations where authority is exercised without scrutiny, where assumptions replace evidence, and where the stakes are higher? He thought of the countless individuals he had stopped in his career, wondering how many had been judged unfairly, how many had felt the sting of assumptions before ever having the chance to present the truth. Each memory brought a pang of regret but also a commitment to change. He resolved to approach future interactions with caution, awareness, and humility, recognizing that patience and understanding are as vital to law enforcement as training and authority. Meanwhile, the FBI agent had reached a quiet part of the street, where his presence was no longer a spectacle. Yet even in solitude, he reflected on the encounter. His mission had been official, procedural, but the unexpected confrontation had become a teachable moment. He knew the power of composure and credibility, and he understood that actions, even in ordinary situations, can leave lasting impressions. The lesson he had imparted, the quiet demonstration of patience, professionalism, and authority balanced with respect, would resonate long after the cameras were put away and the crowd dispersed. Back on the street, the officer approached a group of bystanders, his voice calmer now, but carrying an earnest tone. "I realize now that assumptions can be dangerous," he said. "I acted based on perception, not facts. Today reminded me that fairness, patience, and reflection are as important as enforcing the law." Some of the bystanders nodded, appreciating the sincerity of his acknowledgement. It was rare to witness such genuine self-reflection in real time, and the moment quietly shifted from confrontation to reconciliation. The encounter had also sparked a subtle ripple of conversation among those present. Pedestrians who had initially viewed the scene as a typical police stop now discussed broader themes: bias, racial profiling, authority, and accountability. Some debated how often assumptions influence everyday interactions, not just in law enforcement but in workplaces, schools, and communities. Others reflected on the importance of calm composure in tense situations and how a single person's patience and professionalism can transform conflict into understanding. For the officer, these discussions were more than background noise, they were a mirror reflecting the consequences of his actions. He realized that accountability extends beyond personal reflection, it extends to the community, to colleagues, and to every individual he encounters in his role. Today had been a lesson delivered in real time, under the watchful eyes of the public, and he understood the magnitude of the responsibility now resting on his shoulders. The FBI agent, having paused at a quiet corner, looked back briefly, almost imperceptibly. He didn't need to say anything, the officer had already internalized the lesson. The encounter had been resolved not with conflict or aggression, but with revelation, reflection, and mutual acknowledgement. It was a quiet victory for reason, patience, and professionalism. And it was a reminder that even moments fraught with tension and bias could be transformed into opportunities for growth and understanding. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the street, life around them resumed its ordinary rhythm. Cars drove by, pedestrians walked past, and the city carried on. Yet for those who had witnessed the confrontation, the officer, the bystanders, and even the distant observers who would later view the recordings, the day had been marked by an extraordinary lesson. A lesson in humility, a lesson in the danger of assumptions, and a lesson in the quiet but undeniable power of truth. The officer finally straightened, a subtle sense of resolve replacing the tension in his posture. He had been humbled, challenged, and educated in a way few experiences could achieve. The FBI agent had moved on, his presence fading into the crowd, but the imprint of the encounter remained. The officer understood that authority alone is meaningless without fairness, that assumptions can blind even the most experienced, and that true professionalism requires patience, respect, and reflection. And so, the encounter concluded not with conflict or punishment, but with understanding. The street, once ordinary and unremarkable, had become a classroom, a stage, and a mirror for human behavior. It had demonstrated how bias can cloud judgment, how composure can command respect, and how revelation and reflection can transform confrontation into growth. The officer, now quietly determined, knew that this lesson would guide every interaction he had from that day forward. And the city continued on, carrying the subtle echoes of a moment that had turned the ordinary into something extraordinary. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the street, the ordinary hum of the city gradually returned. Cars drove past, pedestrians resumed their pace, and the distant sounds of the city filled the air once more. Yet, for those who had witnessed the encounter, the day had changed in ways that would linger far longer than the echoes of traffic or casual conversation. What had begun as a routine stop, a moment that might have been forgotten in minutes, had transformed into a profound lesson about perception, bias, and the delicate balance between authority and understanding. The officer stood quietly at the edge of the sidewalk, his posture straight but contemplative. The adrenaline that had surged through him moments earlier had subsided, replaced by reflection. He replayed the encounter in his mind over and over, the initial suspicion, the escalating tension, the unwavering calm of the man he had stopped, and finally, the revelation of the FBI badge. Each detail carried a lesson, a reminder that authority alone does not guarantee justice, and assumptions can obscure the truth in ways that are both subtle and dangerous. Around him, the small crowd had largely dispersed, though whispers of the incident lingered in the air. Phones continued to capture lingering footage, destined to spread across social media, igniting conversations far beyond this one street. The incident had become a story not just about a police stop, but about human behavior, accountability, and the power of calm composure. Onlookers discussed quietly among themselves, questioning assumptions they themselves had made, and reflecting on how easily appearances can deceive. For the officer, the lessons ran deeper. He thought of every encounter where bias, conscious or unconscious, might have influenced his judgment. He understood now that perception is often clouded by personal history, societal conditioning, and subconscious assumptions. Today's experience forced him to confront these truths directly, and in doing so, offered a rare opportunity for personal growth. He realized that true authority comes not from fear, intimidation, or rigid enforcement, but from fairness, understanding, and the willingness to reflect on one's own actions. The man, the FBI agent, had moved down the street with measured steps, but his impact remained. His calm demeanor, patience, and quiet revelation had diffused tension without confrontation. He had demonstrated that true authority is rooted in professionalism, integrity, and respect for others. By showing the officer who he truly was, the agent had not only resolved the immediate situation but also delivered a lesson that would resonate long after the encounter. It was a subtle but powerful reminder: appearances are deceiving, assumptions are dangerous, and composure combined with truth can transform a potentially volatile situation into a moment of education and reflection. As the officer watched him leave, he felt a mixture of humility and resolve. He understood that moments like these are rare but invaluable. They serve as mirrors, reflecting not only the actions of others but also the flaws and biases within ourselves. Today, he had been confronted with the consequences of assumptions and the importance of patience. He silently vowed that this lesson would guide him in all future encounters, not just as a law enforcement officer, but as a human being navigating a world full of diverse experiences, backgrounds, and stories. The onlookers who had recorded the encounter would carry the story with them as well. Some would share it online, sparking debates about bias, policing, and racial profiling. Others would discuss it in private, reflecting on their own judgments and assumptions. The encounter had become more than just a street confrontation. It had evolved into a microcosm of societal challenges, highlighting the universal tension between perception and reality, authority and accountability, suspicion and trust. Even as the city resumed its ordinary rhythm, the memory of the encounter lingered like a subtle echo. The street, though physically unchanged, had been marked by a moment that transcended routine. It had showcased the fragility of assumptions, the danger of judgment based solely on appearances, and the profound impact that calm, professional behavior can have in high-pressure situations. It reminded everyone present that accountability, reflection, and integrity are far more powerful than fear, bias, or aggression. The officer finally exhaled, feeling a quiet shift within himself. He understood that the encounter would remain a defining moment in his career, not for its tension or conflict, but for the lesson it imparted. Authority without understanding is empty, judgment without evidence is dangerous, and composure in the face of confrontation is a tool more powerful than any badge or uniform. The realization settled over him like a quiet promise. He would carry this awareness into every future interaction, approaching each person with patience, fairness, and respect. The FBI agent, meanwhile, disappeared into the flow of the city, his presence a reminder of professionalism and the power of calm composure. To him, the incident was a demonstration of the quiet but profound influence that individuals can have on others, not through confrontation or aggression, but through patience, clarity, and truth. The lesson had been delivered, the situation resolved, and the street returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet the impact was far from ordinary. For everyone who witnessed the scene, the takeaway was clear: assumptions can cloud judgment, bias can distort reality, and even those in positions of authority are not immune to error. Yet, patience, professionalism, and a commitment to truth can transform tension into understanding, confrontation into reflection, and fear into respect. The encounter was a reminder that even small moments, if handled with integrity and awareness, can have profound consequences, not just for the individuals involved, but for everyone who observes, learns, and carries the lesson forward. And so, as the city carried on and the shadows grew long across the street, the story concluded not with punishment, conflict, or anger, but with understanding. A street, once ordinary, had become a stage for revelation. A man, judged unfairly, had revealed truth and authority. And an officer, confronted with his own assumptions, had been humbled, educated, and inspired to do better. The moment had ended, but its lessons would echo far beyond this one corner, reminding all who heard it that fairness, patience, and reflection are the truest measures of character, authority, and humanity.